Jacksonville. The child was born and couldn't sit still. 86 years later with no regret. You know that man can't sit still yet. The Great Depression couldn't get him down. He worked for his dad's store in town, collecting money in small amounts for poor whites and blacks in their furniture accounts. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. As he'd collect, he'd talk to folks. He'd hear legends, tales, songs, and jokes. Now this fine treasure he'd record and write. He was colorblind, didn't see black and white. Writer's project for the WPA. Zora Neale Hurston, he earned his pay. Crackers and blacks, they talked for hours. It was a barefoot history of this land of flowers.
The week was on the 8th of September 2018 from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. An interesting week to review. A number of things, of course, occurred. One of an associate of Papadopoulos, I don't have his name right before me now, but nonetheless he was given roughly 2 weeks in jail and a year of supervised, as they say, suspended sentence, what it amounted to. He was one of those that was indicted for basically not registering as an agent of a foreign government, I believe it was. That's one of the latest little shoes to fall. And of course the hearing of confirmation hearing of Kavanaugh, the judge, and his endorsement by the Judiciary Committee of the American Bar Association that he was qualified. If many will recall, there was a time during G.W. Bush administration that the American Bar Association was no longer involved in the recommendation of judges. They were out of the loop. Now they're back in the loop, so to speak. Now, no one is arguing that Kavanaugh does not have judicial experience. He does have judicial experience. There's no doubt about that. But however, also what has come out of this hearing, and there's little the Democrats can do about it. The man is a pathological liar and a right-winger and a judicial, his philosophy excuse me, is not a rigid conservatism, but a political agenda type operator. In other words, he is not one that interprets the Constitution based upon statutes and case law. His interpretation is based upon political expediency. One of the things that came to light in the G.W. Bush administration, and actually when he was during the Clinton years with Ken Starr, he was a proponent of the presidency being under the microscope. In other words, a vigorous prosecution of Bill Clinton, much more vigorous than Ken Starr. Excuse me. Now he's written a paper and was in the Minnesota Law Journal saying basically that the president was too busy to be a party to a civil litigation and any kind of civil litigation or basically any other charge, obstruction of justice, should be done after the president's term expire. Of course, the Constitution has a remedy for that. It's called impeachment, high crimes, misdemeanors, and what that basically means is the Congress determines. It's a political process. It's not a judicial court process, and the evidence is collected and managers are there. Remember being involved in Alcee Hastings. Alcee Hastings is now a member of Congress, but at the time Alcee Hastings sat in the federal district court in Miami, Florida, the only African American to sit in the South. He was impeached and tried by the Senate and removed. Now, that is the ultimate situation for cases such as DJ Trump. Now, the other situation we'll get to in a minute is the 25th Amendment. That allows members of his general staff to determine that the president is incapacitated, and that's a process by which he can be removed from office. In other words, unfit, either physically, a stroke or some debilitating situation, neurological problem, or a problem, a psychological-based problem. Now, the anonymous op-ed piece that arrived at the at the New York Times, basically said that DJ Trump was a man that was not fit to hold the office, but did not merit the 25th Amendment. That he was a person that could not make a decision, and decisions that he made were impulsive, basically speaking there, and that it was not the, as they say, the hand of a captain sailing a ship upon calm waters of a sea. The ship of state would be the ship, and using metaphorically here. But that was basically what it said, and it's very interesting how it was taken by the press reports and by the general public. No doubt people in Washington spooked. Now, how it played in Peoria, we'll have to look at polling and see later polling till it comes in. And John Dean wrote about this. John Dean, of course, was the White House counsel in Watergate. And there is an indication, at least in the history, that people in the 70s, during Watergate, the general public was more attuned to what was going on in Watergate, even if they were supporters of Richard Nixon. They saw the obstruction of justice, the cover-ups there, etc., and Nixon's proclaiming, "I'm not a crook." Well, basically, the American people, over 50%, believed he was a crook, and that got to be more and more. Now, yes, there were some diehard Republicans, and they made a comeback with Ronald Reagan. Less than 10 years later, basically speaking, that happened in the early 70s, Watergate, and of course, we had Gerald Ford, the late Gerald Ford, sworn in as the president. He ran for re-election in 1976 against Jimmy Carter of Georgia. Jimmy Carter won that election. But there was a different atmosphere within the country, and the country was not so polarized, because we didn't have social media at the time, but there were people that believed that Nixon did not do it. There were conservative elements, but the conservative elements at that time were not as well organized, nor were they as well financed. They were financed. Nixon had a Southern strategy. He used race, piggybacking off of the work of George Cornwallis of Alabama. He was able to do that. Wallace ran, of course, in 68, and then again he ran in 72. But that was when Richard Nixon won re-election by a landslide after many, many dirty tricks. Now, after the 72 election, and he defeated Dr. George McGovern of South Dakota. Yes, George McGovern, a liberal, did come from South Dakota. It was a different day in South Dakota than it is today. South Dakota now is a Republican state. We have had numerous people there, Senator Alvarez, Senator, let's see, you got his name right now, but anyway, he was long-standing a senator from South Dakota and became a specialist in health care. But you would think that that was no longer the situation where the Republicans have, as they say, habitually rule the roost in those areas in the Dakotas, North and South Dakota. Now we do have Heidi Camp there. Those areas, North Dakota and South Dakota, have a history of progressivism. And that's kind of a very interesting situation as to how people looked at things such as Watergate. People had a sense, I believe, I was a young man at the time, but a sense of what was correct and what was incorrect. Right and wrong, as some would say. Not necessarily from a moralistic standpoint, but from a historical standpoint. Yes, you had the Vietnam War, and it was a situation that the public was decidedly against the Vietnam War. And in the 1970, we were less than 30 years out of the Great Patriotic War in 1945, 65, 75. So less actually than 20 years out. If you look at 45 to 55, 55, 20 or 30 years, I suppose. But a very short time in the history. So you had a different people there. That is one reason why I remember even the Pentagon Papers was a big thing. And of course, it was a bestseller by the New York Times. That was when people read more. Today, people read less. Many people read very, very little. They used to get their news from the network channels. Now they get it from social media, which social media has a lot of fake news there. Alex Jones was just vanished from Twitter. And he'd already been vanished from Facebook and several other outlets for being a notorious fake news merchant. But not only that, it was a highly profitable situation. It was not that he was just giving out fake news, but at the same time he was actually profiting from it. Now he has a few lackeys out there that are still have their shows on some of these medias. And you have to understand that the Facebooks of the world, the Googles of the world, etc., they are for-profit enterprises, and they're in there to make profits. And that is basically what drives them. And these characters that have millions of followers make money for these social media platforms, and that's the reason they are allowed to stay exactly where they are. But back to John Dean, his comments there as far as where democracy is. If we start to look at some of the polling, and we're looking to see trends here, it sometimes takes a bit of time for the American people to react. But in general, if the American people are given the correct information, they tend to do better. And that is more of a nightmare for the Republicans that enable DJ Trump. One of the things that has come out here, there was a scenario, a script written where all of this came about because of DJ Trump. Absolutely not. He's enabled by the Republican Party, the leadership of the Republican Party, and if you want to do a casebook study, you would go to the Kavanaugh hearings. They are the people that will uphold Kavanaugh. Why? Because Kavanaugh is a business-friendly judge, along with Gorsuch and the rest of those characters are business-friendly. They will keep business in a business, so to speak, by being anti-union, anti-environment, anti-women. And so, in other words, what we're doing here is parading a bunch of negatives up here. And that is one of the things we do not necessarily want to do. But the situation is everything is dialectic. So we have negatives, we have to have some positives out of it. And when we go to some of the polling, we'll look at that. Uncle Carl also talks about Kavanaugh and where Kavanaugh actually is. Incidentally, out of Minneapolis, I was going to read that article. The copper that killed the lady from Australia was evaluated, and they what happens, these police departments, they do psychological evaluations, and his psychological evaluation raised flags that he was too prone basically to jump to the gun. This is the Muhammad Noor and Justine there that was brutally killed because of that. So there was a breakdown in the hiring process. The reason I jumped to that was this whole atmosphere. DJ Trump talking about the cops basically should knock more heads. Or perhaps Muhammad Noor heard that and decided he would just shoot somebody. But we see a lot of that happening out here in that space where innocent people are literally murdered by coppers. And that is one of the outcomes of the society, this polarization. Now, the issue is, how far will this particular kind of polarization go? We'll have some new job information out there. That'll be on Numbers Man, which is also part of the Boston Red Network. That will come later this weekend. We'll talk about the job numbers. Some are up, some are down. You can't have sustained a situation with the jobs because the jobs themselves are in a dynamic situation, and we always have to look to those. Let me just move now to our prepared script, and we'll start with Uncle Carl. We talked about Kavanaugh. He's writing in the Wall Street Journal what Kavanaugh did at the White House. It didn't take long for the anonymity to emerge on Capitol Hill Tuesday. The Democratic senators tag team Judiciary Chairman Chuck Grassley, he's from Iowa, from the very start of Judge Kavanaugh's Supreme Court confirmation hearing, as squads of shouting audience members added to the chaos. Democrats demanded Grassley adjourn the hearing or suspend the nomination until hell freezes over. Senator Kamala Harris, she's from California. We cannot possibly move forward. Senator Booker of New Jersey questioned Grassley's decency and integrity. Well, that's a waste of time. Senator Blumenthal, he's from Connecticut, imploded Judge Kavanaugh to ask for a postponement because this process has been a great disservice to you. To later hearings, Democrats are determined to get every document Kavanaugh has touched as a White House staff secretary under G.W. Bush. If they can't get the papers, they intend to smear Kavanaugh by asking, as Senator Leahy did, "What are you trying to hide?" I worked in the G.W. Bush White House with three staff secretaries. Harriet Mier was should have been to the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh and Raul Yentz. I imagine it's Y-A-N-E-S. Anyway, in that position, they review virtually every document the president saw and kept copies as required by the Presidential Records Act of 1978. More important, the staff secretary was responsible for circulating documents to as many as a score of administrative officials, drafts of memos, statements, speeches, schedules, briefing books, proclamations, and scripts. The staff secretary would then serve as an impartial judge by reviewing and reconciliating the comments on the documents. He would ensure that they are accurate, concise, clear, thorough and timely, and given the best possible expression to the views of the president's advisors. Senator Mazie, she's from Hawaii, Hirano, may have been correct that in the Democratic White House, staff secretaries routinely put their finger on the scale to push favorable policy outcomes. Not in Bush 43's West Wing. There, the staff secretaries didn't advocate for the a preference outcome. If he did, he would have been removed from the position. Ms. Myers, talking about Harriet Myers, she was actually going to be nominated to the Supreme Court, and Mrs. Kavanaugh and Yans, I suppose, were facilitators, not policymakers. Their responsibility is to make sure documents express the views of the president's advisors as well as possible. That made their job one of the West Wing's toughest. It required an ability to understand what someone wants to convey, and if necessary, to help say it in a better way. In other words, that's editing of the documents. Here, Uncle Carl gives some things away. It took exceptional diplomatic skills to navigate changes with high-powered White House aides. It involved extensive fact-checking for accuracy and a consistency with past documents, and there were a lot of paper to deal with all the time. No wonder Judge Kavanaugh called it a formative experience to have served in this intellectual and professionally demanding position. It's why he and his staff were among the brightest people in the White House. We wonder about that. The materials from Kavanaugh's time as a staff secretary includes highly sensitive presidential documents. They're released before the year set by federal law could violate Mr. Bush's executive privilege. I thought we'd get around this sooner or later without providing any substantive insight into Judge Kavanaugh's views. It can't be emphasized enough that these aren't policy recommendations from Kavanaugh. The material has passed through his hands came from policymakers in the administration. Careful textual analysis might yield evidence of Kavanaugh's talent in coaxing colleagues into more clarity and greater brevity and deeper analysis, but would reveal nothing about his personal views. That is absolutely false. Not the case at all on Kavanaugh. So this is what we know about Kavanaugh, don't know about Kavanaugh, period. We'll come back to the Seattle story, the banning of Alex Jones' app for objectionable content. Apple said on Friday that it has banned from its app store the InfoWorld app belonging to the conspiracy theorist Jones, after finding that it violated the company's rule against objectionable content. The move makes Apple the latest tech company, or a social media platform to take action against Jones, a deeply controversial right-wing talk show host who has suggested that the Sandy Hook massacre was a hoax, amongst other sensational claims. Apple said the guidelines Jones violated, defamatory, discriminatory mean-spirited content, including references or commentary about religion, race, sexual orientation, gender, national or ethnic origins, and other targeted groups, particularly if the app is likely to intimidate or place a targeted individual or group in harm's way. Representative Jones obviously didn't have anything to say. In a video posted on InfoWars site, Jones said in response, "I was taken down not because we lied, but because we tell the truth and because we were popular." Apple said at the time that followers of the InfoWorld app remained in its store because it had not found it to be in violation of any content policy, although it had removed access to some podcasts by Jones. So now we have Google, Alphabet Inc., Facebook, Spotify, Technology SA have also removed content produced by Jones. So Jones is continually moving out. While we're here, is Mr. Charlie Cook, the best, in our opinion, at least handicapper in America. He's writing on the 7th of September for over 6 months. His column has suggested this election amounts to a Democratic tidal wave crushing against a Republican seawall. The question is which will be stronger at Labor Day, the traditional beginning of the general election campaign season. That continues to be the case. Though how that dynamic manifests itself will likely vary between the House and Senate governorships and state legislatures. There is no mistake of this wave. For better or for worse, midterm elections are referenda on the president, with roughly one-third fewer people voting in midterms than in presidential years. In many places, it's about 50%. Voters who votes and who stays home is critically important. People who are angry or fearful tend to be disproportionately more motivated to vote in midterm elections than those who are satisfied or complacent. DJ Trump's approval ratings have typically been the lowest of any post-Second World War elected president in their first 2 years. Occasionally this number has ticked above those of Jimmy Carter in 1977 and 1978. But they have trailed those of President Clinton and Barack Obama, both who suffered catastrophic losses in their first midterm elections, of those Reagan, who had moderate losses, a different time. Both President Bushes had strong polling numbers at this point. The elder Bush, or the first Bush, only lost small numbers of House seats in 1990. During the Gulf War, the younger Bush, G.W. Bush, gained seats in 2002. That's after the 9/11 attack. His popularity was the highest. The key variable between a bad night for the GOP and a horrible night is whether those Republicans who are not part of either the Tea Party or white evangelical Republicans are not enthusiastic Trump backers that vote on Election Day. Unforeseen events that could occur, but history shows that between a midsummer and November's midterm waves remain constant or grow in size, and have not reversed directions or diminished. Still, this is where the GOP wall comes into play. In the House, the wall is comprised of congressional district boundaries drawn in many states by Republican legislators, governors at the beginning of this decade. Many state legislative boundaries were drawn to the GOP's advantage. Then as well, there are exceptions, of course, like Illinois and Maryland, where Democrats have gerrymandered, had the gerrymander pin in their hands, but they are very rare, no doubt about it. There are natural population patterns, with Democrats voting highly concentrated in urban areas, Republican voters more efficiently allocated outside the cities, working to protect many GOP majorities in the event of a mild to moderate-sized Democratic wave. We are most likely looking at Democratic gains in the House between 20 and 40 seats, with the odds going higher than 30, maybe 40, or greater than going lower to 30 and 20 seats. This is not good news. While a House with all of its seats up every 2 years has long been a highly sensitive political barometer of the national mood, the Senate is less so. 6-year terms there, with 1/3 of the seats up every 2 years. The upper chamber behaves in a more way. What happened 6 to 12 years early in a critical one-time group of Senate seats are up in a presidential year. The next time that group is up in a midterm year. As a result, the rhythm of the Senate elections are totally different from the House, and for that matter, gubernatorial and Senate legislative races. The 2018 group of Senate seats was last up in 2006, 2012. Two very good years for Democrats. One reason is why most lopsided Senate map in modern history. One is very favorable to the Republicans. GOP has 9 seats up, only one in a state, Nevada, that Hillary Clinton carried, while the Democrats have 26 seats up and 10 in states that DJ Trump prevailed. The Republican wall defending their Senate majority appears to be substantially higher than the House. Only with a bigger wave do the Democrats gain 2 seats or more to win a majority. If Democrats have a fantastic year, they would score a net gain of 2 to 4 seats. But the map trumps the wave. You can easily see Democrats losing 2 to 4 seats between Democratic gains of 4 to Republican gains of 4. There are 9 potential net change outcomes. 6 of 9 Republicans maintain their majority. The kicker is that with so many small states in play, there could be a relatively small number of voters making a difference in a handful of races. There's no doubt about that. With 3/4 of the nation governorships, 4/5 of the nation's legislatures up this year, almost all of the 4-year terms, and lasts up to pro GOP 2010 and the 2014 Obama midterm elections. Republicans now have huge exposure in many states like the House. Those districts' boundaries serve as protective walls against Republican losses. Tim Story, the election guru at the National Conference of State Legislatures, points out that from 1902 to 2014, the average midterm outcome was a loss of 412 seats, including previous odd-year elections since World War II. The losses have been a bit lower, 334. Story estimates that with a generic congressional ballot test advantage Democrats up to 6 points, it would likely translate into a gain of close to 500 Senate legislative seats nationwide for Democrats. Like the U.S. House, the curve is asymmetric. The chances of over 500 are greater than under. That's with 8%. We don't have an 8% generic ballot now. Republican governors do not have the favorable red-blue map that GOP senators have, and the districts lined advantages that Republicans in the House and state legislatures have in many states. So Republican prospects may be particularly ugly with a loss of 5 or more governorships. Let's look at some polling here. This is on Friday. Kind of interesting here, some of this polling. Not very decisive at this point in time, but this is from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. This is Stacey Abrams and Kemp. They're tied up at 45-45. Most people would have ventured to say that Mr. Kemp would be ahead at least by 4 to 5 points. Now, in the state of Utah, this is District 4 out there, Love versus McAdams. Now, Love is an African-American lady in Utah. She's up by 3 points over McAdams, 49-46. This is a Utah Policy and Dan Jones. Not sure who they are. California District 48. This is Raffenbacher. They're tied up 45 to 45 with Router. This is the New York Times Cynical poll there, and we have Illinois is rocking and Keston at one point there for rocking. In Illinois, 12 Boost and Kelly. Boost by 1. That is a New York Times poll also. And, well, this is Rasmussen. Has old DJ Trump at 48. Now, if we go down to Thursday, we have in the state of Tennessee, breezing up by 2 over Marsha Blackburn. And in the Tennessee, that's a Senate race, the governor's race, Lee up by 18 over Dean. Not sure about who those people are. And this is, we talked about them, Grinnell College and the Salsa poll. DJ Trump's approval rating at 43, and generic ballot has the Democrats up by 2. That's Grinnell College out of Iowa. And on Wednesday we had Donnelly and Brim out of Indiana. Donnelly, the Democrat, this is according to NBC News Marxist College. Donnelly up by 6. That's interesting there. I'm not sure if he's up by 6, but anyway. And out of Quinnipiac, Scott and Nelson are tied up in that poll. That is in the Senate race in the state of Florida. In Utah, we have Romney over Wilson up by 26. There, this is another Utah policy poll. Approval rating from YouGov, approval rating from Reuters, 43-42. That's DJ Trump. And the generic ballot, this is Reuters ISOS. That has the Democrats up by 9. The YouGov people up by 5. And we won't get the congressional one. It's a waste of time. And Tuesday we have Claire McCaskill and Hockley are tied up in the state of Missouri. A Gravis poll has Scott and Nelson tied up. And the governor's race there, Mr. Gillum's up by 2 over DeSantis. This was on Tuesday the 4th. And we have a Quinnipiac poll has Gillum up by 3. So he's in the margin of error. That's Andrew Gillum in Florida. And ABC News on the generic ballot has the Democrats up by 14. USA Today, their generic ballot has the Democrats up by 11. So we'll just say they're up. I guess it's an easy way of saying it. So we've had Mr. Cook, the handicapper. We've looked at some polling here. And basically, generic ballot is very important. Now, this is after Labor Day. We'll be looking at the generic ballot throughout September and into October to see if there is any movement. We'll start looking at the battleground states, particularly Missouri. And we have a little theory in Missouri. That's what Claire McCaskill's race at Hockley does the or did the impact of the right to work initiative there, but failed by 62% of the people. Does that have any impact on the Senate race there in Missouri between McCaskill and Hockley? We'll see. Our theory right now is perhaps it does. But we'll see. Very, very close race going on in Missouri. Now, we've had some low items, 36, I think, percent there in an independent business daily poll. But DJ Trump has remained, even after the op-ed piece, and Bob Woodward's excerpts from Bob Woodward's book coming out. His disapproval has not moved, but we look at the Gunnell, we looked at it. It was in Iowa. It has, in fact, moved in the salsa poll. So we'll see how that turns out. Let's do the sports here. In college football, we only had one game last night. The other games are today, Saturday. The one game, TCU, 42-12 over SMU. Anyway, the baseball scores from last night. The Reds 12 and the Padres 6. That's in Cincy. And in wait a minute here. 11, the Cleveland and Toronto are the Blue Jays. 3-2 the score there. And then we have the Marlins and Pirates in Pittsburgh. Pirates 5-3. The Astros and Red Sox in Fenway Park. The Astros 6-3 over the Sox. The Cardinals and Tigers in the Motor City. Cardinals lost the game 3-6. Or I guess we should say the Tigers 6-3. And the Phillies and Mets in New York. Phillies 4-3. The Orioles and Rays in Florida. Rays 14-2. The Angels and White Sox on the south side of Chicago. Angels 5-2. The Giants and Brewers in Milwaukee. I guess the Brewers didn't drink too much beer. 4-2 over the hapless Giants. The Royals and Twins in Minnesota. Twins 10-6. Two teams that are going nowhere. The Dodgers and Rockies in the Mile High City. Dodgers 4-2. Mr. Kershaw was a winner. Well, we can expect that. Atlanta and the D-backs in the desert. Diamondbacks 5-3. The Rangers and Athletics in Oakland. Oakland 8-4 over the Rangers. The Yankees were out in Seattle and shut out the Mariners 4-0. And I guess it's the game between the Cubs and Nationals postponed probably for rain in D.C. Was that the only game the Cubs had? I suppose, yeah, the Cubs are on the road playing the Nationals. So basically, this is what we have out of Seattle, the Seattle Times. I guess this will be our closing story. Seattle's crusading activism gets expensive as lawsuits pile up. The big question about the Seattle City Council these past few years, in my view, is whether it's a traditional governing body, more or less, or it has turned into a fully an activist group. This is by David Westnet. There are now a test case of sorts because the city council just got sued precisely for behaving like socialist activists. It has been a trend, and this is just a precarious example, said Brad Wheeler, the Seattle lawyer who filed the new lawsuit. There has been a sense coming out of City Hall that the end are however well-intentioned ends, and intention justifies the means. This doesn't make it different, or whether they do it is legal or illegal. Keller represents the owners of Showbox, the property downtown, that beloved music spot that was set to be torn down for a 44-story apartment tower before the city council stepped in last month to try to save it. The lawsuit argues that when the city drew that one lot into historic district, it effectively took the developer's rights without paying. But more telling, the lawsuit also says that the whole way the city council went about its work by cheerleading and doing usual crusading was so activist that it itself was illegal. The council failed to recuse biased members from voting and actually campaigned on behalf of a position on the issue and made it biased, prejudged statements. Now the above paragraph definitely sounds like Iowa City Hall. The lawsuit specifically calls out Councilman there, Karma Shawang, for behavior. She is a progressive, but the difference in this case is that why the council members are free to act as cheerleaders when crafting ordinances that affect broad groups or entire city. They're supposed to behave more soberly. Well, that's just insane there. Lawsuit is for $40 million, when, as Kelly said, is a simple calculation of what the land is worth, is currently zoned, and the 44-story apartment tower minus what worth frozen time. This is a really silly thing. City Minneapolis, Seattle. I've been reading a book about bike trails and those two. The city of Minneapolis, still on this, Seattle should own this. The employees at the Showbox should be the city of Minneapolis's employees. There's no reason why we shouldn't do this. Anyway, this is a column here, basically, that this particular lawyer is crusading on behalf of a developer. Now, the city and its activists here Sawant, I suppose is how you pronounce it, attempts to save the Showbox, moves ahead. This is a picture of her. Seattle council member, Sharma Sawant, S-A-W-A-N-T, proposed to save the Showbox by expanding the Pikes Peak Historic District to include the historic venue. Passed its first on Monday when the council agreed that it would fast-track consideration. This is done many times in many cities. Nothing new about that. However, the inclusion of the showboat in the Pike Place Market, that's at Peak, the Pike Place Market Historic District, would put it under the oversight of the Market's Historical Commission. The Pike Place Market Historical District currently ends a few feet west on the other side of First Avenue, first from the historic nightclub. Sawant's proposal would expand the district east across First Avenue between Union Street and Virginia Street, including more than 3 blocks of buildings in addition to the venue. There's nothing wrong with that. And finish this up. I'll throw it up on the Facebook page. We have to fight hard to win the preservation of the Showbox now. But as a socialist, I never stop with one victory. Swanup said, I see no reason why this movement should not go forward, and this should be a public-owned venue. The city of Minneapolis, I keep saying Minneapolis, the city of Seattle should own this, and the employees of the Showbox should be the city of Seattle's employees, and there's no reason why we should not do this. Well, that's a statement of a city council member in the city of Seattle. There's no reason why it should not. Perfectly right. She ran as a socialist and is a socialist. And if the city of Seattle, their commission, goes forward and they fast-track the Showbox in that historic district down there by the Pike Market, is historical district. The market there, Pike Place Market. I remember when actually they lived there. They had horses. at the market there. So you're going to have some of these kooks coming out here. Um, some right-wing columnists. I don't know if they have this bird here as a right-wing columnist. No doubt he is. And this is it. I'll throw it up there from the Seattle Times. And we'll also put the one up there from the Stranger, which is an interesting one. Well, we'll get up there eventually and see where it goes. We normally read the Post-Intelligentsia in not necessarily the Seattle Times, but they do share some facilities now. From Amazon has patented a system that would put workers. What? I guess I have to get this one. Hopefully, I can get it. Would put workers in a cage on top of a robot. We're going to put this on Facebook. The patented has received would pair humans and machines. The illustration that the company accompanied the patent. It's a robot trolleys, kind of robot trolleys. The patent calls an extraordinary illustration of worker alienation and stalk movement in a relationship between humans and machines. Amazon said it never implemented the technology and has no plans to do it, but the design appears to be an effort to allow humans to safely enter robot-only zones. In an Amazon facility in Kent, for example, a 750-pound robot topped with shelf around an area surrounded by high chain link fence brings merchandise like iPhone cases, coffee mugs to waiting workers. If an unauthorized human strays into robot-only zone, the company says an alarm is triggered there, and there's circumstances there. Anyway, like many companies, we file a number of forward-looking patents. I bet they do. Anyway, we'll put this up there. We've always been interested in robots. We've played around with small robots, but nothing to the size of this, of having a human in a cage with a robot. This is a new one for us. Nonetheless, this will do it for us. We'll see you on the Monday morning quarterback. That will be on Monday morning. And we'll quarterback the talk shows. Last week, unfortunately, we had some talk shows. We had we got President Obama's, I think we did, his eulogy of John McCain's. I believe we did put him in, but the other talk shows we left out. Well, sometimes we make mistakes, but nonetheless, this weekend we'll have Numbers Man. That's our macroeconomics program. We'll run that on the BostonRed.org and Boston Red Network, I should say, and also on WBRN Radio. And hopefully we'll have an open source report ready for you too. Have a good weekend, everyone. We'll talk to you on a Monday morning. Good day, as Paul Harvey would say.